earlier I mentioned that the Japanese American community did not protest en masse, meaning as a whole, because they realized the consequences, the possible ramifications, should they go out and protest as a whole. It would basically reinforce a negative image of them as being an enemy race, disloyal to the laws of the United States and the government. So, therefore, they knew that the best thing to do would be to silently obey the law. But there were indeed individual cases of resistance that would occur even through legal channels. And probably the best known case for this is that of the Korematsu case. So, Fred Korematsu, this person right here, he decided not to report to the Assembly Center on the day he was supposed to. Instead, he went underground. And in fact, during this time, he was underground. He was actually working at a war munitions factory. Okay, so in a way, he was contributing to the war effort. But he was finally caught by the FBI. At the same time, he was approached by some civil rights attorneys because these attorneys realized that what was being done towards the Japanese Americans was so blatantly unconstitutional. So they offered to handle his case, and thereby challenging the constitutionality of Japanese American internment itself through Fred Korematsu. Now, this would reach the Supreme Court by 1944. And in case you didn't know, 1944, the war ended in 1945. This is the year before the war ended. And in 1944, the Supreme Court basically upheld his conviction. They did not repeal or declare Executive Order 9066 as being unconstitutional. Now, the writer of the opinion, the Supreme Court opinion, his name is Justice Hugo Black. And interestingly enough, Hugo Black, many years before he was the Supreme Court Justice, he was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, he defended it in his life, saying, hey, I was in politics and in the South. If you're not a member of the Ku Klux Klan, you won't get elected, so on and so forth. But, it does boggle the mind to see how someone in the Supreme Court could be an ex-member of the Klan. Nonetheless, there were public announcements made by Hugo Black, even after his decision and the Supreme Court. By the way, the decision was a 6-3 vote, okay, upholding the conviction of Korematsu. But Hugo Black, going back to him, he later went public justifying his internment, and he said, quote, "They all look alike to a person, not a Jap," unquote. Now, there were some dissenting judges that said, no, this is wrong. Obviously, the 3 vote, right? 6-3. You had 3 judges saying this is a clear violation of the Constitution based on racism. And they used the term racism, right? And it's basically based on racial ancestry. And we have to give them credit, right? Okay, so Korematsu case was not in favor of Korematsu. But later on, you had the Endo case reaching the court. Now, Endo, and that's this person on the right, she was actually approached by civil rights attorneys while in the Assembly Center itself. And she agreed to go along with it. And the Endo decision was finally reached in 1945. And that's the year that the war ended. And I should say the handwriting was on the wall in terms of the outcome of World War II. The Japanese were in full retreat. We knew we were going to win the war. And, the conclusion was pretty much a foregone one. Now, with the Endo decision, it ruled in favor of, ending Japanese internment. Okay, so the Endo case was a year after Korematsu, and it was the opposite decision. Now, after the Endo case, the WRA, War Relocation Authority, they began to speak of the release of the Japanese. Okay, they had to apply for quote release clearance, and this would be a drawn out bureaucratic process. But interestingly, they didn't actually investigate each person in the camp, each applicant. All they did was check the names of the applicants against a list of suspects that were deemed still disloyal, right? And then they were freed. So, in other words, they loosened up with the paranoia that they were all an enemy race. Okay, so interesting to note how the Korematsu case and the Endo case ended up in different um, decisions. And one can argue that it was due to, the war's ending being now determined by 1945. Now, the main point here is, after they were evacuated from the camp, and once internment ended, that's when the public fears were finally assuaged, that they were finally alleviated, right? They were finally willing to consider the loyalty of Japanese Americans once the war ended. So, to put this in other terms, the Japanese Americans en masse as a whole were presumed guilty before proven innocent, presumed guilty of being an enemy race. Now, here are some key questions and discussion for this topic of Japanese internment, but I want to go down here because it just fits right where we left off our discussion. Why did some Japanese protest the close of the concentration camps? Okay, that's interesting. Now, a lot of them didn't. Okay, most of the vast majority said, okay, we welcome our freedom, right? And let's get out of here. But a very small number of them didn't protested it. Why? And you can probably imagine why. The answer to that is they had nowhere to go and they had no more property. They had no more money. They had no livelihood, right? So in a way, at least they had a way to sustain their lives in the camp, right? Where were they going to go? For these people, their homes no longer were around for them. Their businesses were taken from them. They had no economic security through jobs or what have you. Okay, so you see some Japanese actually, uh, protested the close of the camps, even though they're a very small number again. Okay, now later on, the Japanese, through the decades, I should say, following internment through the 50s, 60s, and 70s, they were mostly silent about the injustice of internment. And so too was the government in many respects. Okay, it was kind of swept under the carpet, so to speak. But, nonetheless, you see some persons, some legal representatives of the Japanese, bringing the case that the Japanese Americans should achieve redress or restitution, okay, for what they endured, this grievous violation of their constitutional rights. And this was finally achieved in the I should say in 1970. Gerald Ford, who was a president after the impeachment of Nixon, he said he recognized that it was a quote national mistake unquote. And then you had President Carter, who followed Gerald Ford in 1980, set up a commission to look into the relocation effort and to determine if any harm was done to the Japanese people. Now, of course, there's harm that was done, right? Psychological and so forth, economic and so forth. And then you see by the Reagan administration, after this commission said yes, this was a national mistake. The Reagan administration finally acknowledged that what was done to the Japanese was indeed wrong. And after that, you see compensation actually given to the survivors who were still around in the 80s and 90s. Okay. Now, one thing to note here, and this goes to this question of in what ways did the Japanese demonstrate their loyalty? Well, there's two ways you could point this out or demonstrate this. Number one is just through obeying the law. Okay, as I mentioned, they knew the consequences, but when you obey the law of Executive Order 9066, you're basically saying, I'm an obedient citizen. I'm going to follow the laws. Okay, so that's one surefire way where they demonstrated they are loyal Americans. The other way it was demonstrated was through the 442nd Regiment. Okay, and this regiment would be, excuse me, sorry, this regiment would become the most decorated Army regiment in U.S. history, and this is still true today. Okay, basically, you had a draft set up in the concentration camps, and as you can imagine, many young Nisei men said, "Yes, we're going to join and fight, and to demonstrate our loyalty to the United States." Now, of course, they're not going to fight in Japan. Some of them were interpreters in the Pacific theater, but the 442nd would be assigned to the European theater against Germany and Italy. Now, I should mention this. There was no concentration camps set up in Hawaii, and as we know, there were a lot of Japanese Americans in Hawaii. But the reason for this is, the Japanese were deemed too important in the industry there, right? If they interned all the Japanese Americans there, the economy would come to a screeching halt. So that didn't happen in Hawaii, even though Pearl Harbor is exactly in Hawaii. Notice that. But the 442nd Regiment is comprised of Nisei in Hawaii, but also in the West Coast. Now, some people said, no, I'm not going to join this regiment, okay, because I'm being interned here. They took away my freedoms. Why should I fight for freedom abroad, right? But the vast majority of Nisei said, yes, I will fight because notwithstanding the fact, or despite the fact that my family is here, I'm going to prove that, through my actions on the battlefield, that this is wrong and we're indeed Americans. And you can understand why they demonstrated heroic feats and valor on the battlefield because they had something to prove. And by the way, this reminds me of African American regiments towards the end of the Civil War when the same thing happened to them. They fought with remarkable heroism and they turned the tide of the war militarily. Now, the 442nd were similar, right? Because they had something to prove, and they indeed proved it. The fact that they're the most decorated regiment in U.S. history, countless numbers of gold stars, silver stars, bronze, not to mention a lot of Medal of Honors, the highest decoration soldiers can attain. Okay, so going back to these questions here. We know why the Japanese didn't protest in mass. We know some individual case of resistance, and that would be Korematsu and Endo. We know the difference because Korematsu would not be overturned, but Endo would, and of course, the timing of that is important to note. We just addressed the question of loyalty. Distinguish between official reason, and that would be military necessity, or translated today, national security, right? Let's remember War Relocation Authority and even excuse me, DeWitt actually saying, military necessity. But we also uncovered the underlying reason behind Japanese internment, and that's the idea that, according to DeWitt, the racial strains cannot be diluted. That the Japanese race are an enemy race, no matter what. Okay, and to press this further, what explains this belief? Right, it's Orientalism again. Okay, so these are some key questions that hopefully now you could answer. And this concludes the discussion of Japanese American internment.